So today we're going to be taking a little tour of my main mixing template. And you can see up here on our Pro Tools window, this is called Mix Ultra .8. Mix Ultra is just the name I assigned this mixing template. I have some other templates for other things, recording other kinds of mixes, but this is the template that I would say I try and do probably like 90% of my work on. I designed this template so that I could use it for pretty much any genre, any application that you would think of, I can mostly do on this template. I'm going to give you a quick tour, and hopefully there will be some little workflow nuggets that you can extrapolate from this video and maybe incorporate into your own templates. Obviously, as you can see, we're working in Pro Tools. This is my primary DAW. I do probably 90% of my work in Pro Tools right now. So I'm going to start quickly with just an overview of the main page. This is how the template loads. When I create a fresh session off this template, it loads up with everything collapsed like this. So as you can see, we're pretty tidy. It all fits very comfortably onto one screen, which is what I like. Mostly because I would have to load this template with multi-tracks from, whoever the recording engineer is, or I would import this session data into a new session if I was a recording engineer, or I have the Pro Tools, the .ptx from the recording session. I'd probably just import this Pro Tools session into that Pro Tools session so I could move the tracks over. And then if I had just, a set of multi-tracks, I'd probably just import those directly into this session. I would create a new session and name it appropriately. It wouldn't be called Mix Ultra, etc. Okay, so we're here on the mix window. This monitor aux track, it's just a stereo aux track, is actually the utmost fold down of our session. So as you can see, it's routed to output 1 and 2 here. This is what's actually hitting my audio interface. This is what's coming out of my converters here. And there's an input track called monitor aux. We'll talk about the routing in a sec. The plugins that I have loaded here, I have reference, which reference to by mastering the mix. It's just a little like AB plugin, metric AB from Plugin Alliance would be another one. So I can drop wave files in here, whether it's like a listener mix or rough mix, or if I have a reference track from a different artist that I want to reference against the mix I'm doing, I can go back and forth, which is pretty helpful. I like to keep this either bypassed or inactive, just while I'm not using it, to make sure that I'm not accidentally, if I have two versions of the same tune in that plugin, I want to make sure that I'm monitoring the one I'm actually working on. You can trip yourself up with that sometimes. So I like to keep that inactive or bypassed. And then we have Listen Hub. This is really just a receiver plugin for my iPad. Sonox Listen Hub has like a companion iPad app. So this allows me to use my iOS device as basically like a monitor controller. I can mono, I can solo different bands of the actual mix. There's some volume controls, some mute switch, a dim switch. You can actually set it up to toggle between different sources and stuff. I don't have it doing anything like that right now. My main left to right mix is coming into here. It's got some metering built into it. So I basically never look at this. Basically just like the send for my iPad to be able to look at. So then up next, we have the mix print section. So these are actually audio tracks. I'm going to throw back to the edit window here, and you'll see that I have 4 audio tracks labeled out here: standard mix, acapella print, instrumental print, and then hot mix print. So this is where I actually do all of my final mixdown sort of rendering. I'm not a big bounce guy. I don't like to bounce unless I'm doing podcasts or sometimes mastering. I like to bounce, but for the most part, I want to print the actual sums of my mixes in Pro Tools as audio files and then export them from there. That's just a workflow thing. That's the way I like to do it. There's nothing wrong with bouncing if that's how you want to do it. But yeah, so we've got a standard mix, an acapella print, instrumental print, and then hot mix. We'll talk about where these things are getting fed from in a sec from the mix buses, but overall, like, this is where I print my mixes into the track. And then we have our mix buses. So this is where things are actually folding down to. So this instrumental mix bus, this bus right here, instrumental mix bus here, you can see that is my default track output bus. So in the IO window in Pro Tools, I have mine on a hotkey. We go over to bus here. You can select on this drop down menu a default output bus for both stereo and mono tracks. So you'll see we go to bus, it's selected instrumental mix bus. So if I were to create a new track just through the typical dialog, it would automatically, here's that new track I just made, output that track to the instrumental mix bus. Instead of output 1, 2, or whatever it would normally fold down to. So that's really helpful here because that's where I want 90% of my tracks outputting to. If I needed to make a new track, I don't really make new tracks with that window in sessions like this. I use Command Shift N all the time when I'm making tracks in like a recording session. But in a mixing session like this, because my routing is so complex, I typically will wind up duplicating existing tracks and then renaming them, because that comes with their color coding, it comes with their IO destinations and stuff like that. I don't really use this dialog too often, but if I were to, it would send whatever I'm making to the instrumental mix bus track here, which is nice because if it sent it to output 1, 2, it would bypass all this processing here that I'm doing. Okay, so processing on the mix bus, everything hits the instrumental mix bus here first. I've got an instance of ProQ4. This is running a preset that I really like. It's called FFT Sorcery. This is a custom preset that I made. Basically, there's a ProQ3 preset under Dynamic Mix called Subgroup Sorcery. Here, I'll go to it so you can see what it looks like. It looks like this. And basically, it's just a bunch of wide Q dynamic band cuts throughout the entire mix. And this was something that I learned, at a recording studio in New York City that I was working at for a while. A lot of guys were using this, and they were just turning the gain scale on Q4 down like this to make it a little bit more subtle. And so subgroup sorcery evolved into FFT sorcery. So this is a version of that preset that I made. So it's the same concept. It's gain scale turned down to, you can see here, about 35%. Except all of these bands are FFT bands in the new version of FabFilter ProQ4. You can make the bands have spectral elements to them, which is like that Soothe to FFT fast Fourier transformation, resonance suppression. So while I'm putting material through, this is basically like a de-resonancing on everything except the vocals. So all of my instruments in the session, tracks, the 2-track, whatever I'm working on, synths, whatever, that's all flowing through this, and it's doing some resonance suppression, which I find to be really nice. Obviously, I think it's important whenever you're doing something like that to check with bypass. So that would be my workflow going through this. If this template was loaded with multi-tracks, is I would start by coming through and bypassing these things and tweaking them. I never leave these mix bus processing things the same on anything. I use the same stuff every time, which is why I have it preloaded up like this, but I would set them differently depending. And so here, ASG comp, as you can see, that's gold. All of my hardware in Pro Tools is gold. That's just my color coding thing. So this is going to my Audioscape G Stereo VCA, which is like an SSL X Logic G comp hardware unit. So it's like an SSL sort of VCA compressor. I really like that hitting all of my instruments before it goes into the mix bus. Usually it's just pulling down like 2 dB when the snare cuts through. It's just a nice little bit of leveling on the front end before it hits some of my more intensive processing, like my limiting and stuff. Next, I have this Moog EQ4 MS from Plugin Alliance queued up. It's in its default state, factory default, which is effectively nothing. It's not really doing anything like this. But like I said, I'll go through and tweak this depending on the material that I'm working on. So this never looks like this when I'm done. But I like this processor a lot. It's a really transparent, just sort of wideband EQ for mastering. It's got that airband thing that I can really like depending on the genre. I find that in rock music, the airband on 20 sounds really, really good. It helps the cymbals a lot. Only thing with this processor is it can be really heavy-handed. I usually only wind up pushing things around point 0.5 or point 0.1, anywhere more than that, and it starts to be like really aggressive. So you just got to be careful to be gentle with this. And then it's got all these cool controls that sometimes I will use because this is on the 2 bus. So, it's stereo with control, the mono maker if I want to, put everything below 100 or below 200 to mono, I can. And then it's got this auto gain, which is really cool. I'm trying to keep all these processes at unity volume pretty much. I'm not trying to add anything to these. And then we have inflator here on the mix bus as well. This is the last thing it hits before the limiter. Inflator is like a soft clipper kind of color box. I really like it. So I usually run it around this curve somewhere around like 19. Effect will depend on the material. And then I try and keep it at unity. So it's a little confusing because the metering, right? 0 is here in the middle, and then this is like digital 0 up here. So I try and keep them hitting the same level on the input and the output. I don't really like to use inflator for volume boost. I just kind of use it for the saturation curve. But this is a really nice box. It's been described to me by a mastering engineer friend of mine as like his mastering stomp box, his mastering guitar pedal when something needs a little bit of extra saturation or excitement or energy. Like this is kind of his go-to tool. So most of my mixes get printed through this thing. I really like it. Then we just have an instance of Insight in case I want to monitor my levels or my stereo field pre-limiting. I'll do that here. And then we have an instance of Pro L2. This is like my main limiter. I love this limiter. It's great. So I'll basically print a whole version of the mix through this limiter. Pretty much all that's on my limit bus right now. Yeah, limit mix bus is just the limiter. And then another instance of Insight too if I want to check some metering post limiter. And so these all fold into the mix prints. You can see here, the instrumental mix bus just goes directly to the mix bus. So this is just like a direct path. And then here, this is actually a mult. I've got mults all over my session. If you see any of these IO windows that have red and blue, it means that there's a mult happening right there. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically what this is one side of the mult is going to standard mix print right here. And then the other side of the mult is going to the limit mix bus. And I'll click here. You can see I'll have multiple buses selected here for my output. That's a mult in Pro Tools. That's just what I call it. There may be a different technical designation. How you do that, if you want to output one track to multiple bus destinations, just from the track output, is you just hold control while you're in this IO select menu. And then if you click, it'll put a check mark. If you're not holding control, it'll just flip, the entire output of the track to whatever you're selecting. So you could also achieve the same thing by just putting a unity send at post fader and not touching it. I find this to be a little bit cleaner because then my send window is clear. Here it doesn't really matter because I'm not sending my mix buses to stuff usually, but over here in the track area of my template, I do find that to be helpful because I will be putting sends, in places over here. And this way I don't really have to think about my prints. It just kind of happens in the background via the mult. So that's what's happening here. So basically for standard mix print, I am preserving a version of my mix during like a print pass without any limiting on it. And so the same thing will happen for instrumental print here. It's just taking the mix bus input, which means it's taking what's coming into the mix bus, pre-mix bus. So that's pre-fold down of the vocals. And it's pre all this processing. So it's just all of the instruments going through this Q4 resonance suppression thing and the Audioscape G-Comp printed right here. And then for the acapella print, I haven't exactly ironed out a great way to print just all my vocals. So 1-2 track like this. So it's just taking the standard mix print input, and then I just go through and do a separate pass of just vocals after the fact. That's the only thing that I have to do a separate pass for right now. There probably is a way through some complicated means to get in here and make a print possible, but really the big thing is I couldn't find a way to put the vocals through all of this processing over here, EQ4 MS and inflator. And then the hot mix print is post limiter. So you can see here, that's the termination for my limit mix bus. Takes the input from my mix bus, runs it through the limiter, and then outputs it to this track over here. And then all of these tracks are going to monitor aux. As you can see, I have this input monitored right now. Whichever one of these I choose to input monitor is the actual version of the mix I'll be listening to while I'm mixing. So I like to mix through the limiter. So I pretty much just keep it like this all the time. I have these muted just for redundancy, but if I unmute them, you still can't hear them because this is on input monitor. And then that passes out to the monitor aux, which has listen hub and all that stuff on it. All right, we're going to jump to my stem print section. So I print all of my stems like I would be printing my mix buses. I accomplished that through that molt concept I was talking about earlier with my mix bus routing. So these are just all stereo audio tracks that I have for different groups of tracks in my session. As you can see, drums, bass, guitar, horns, etc. And then I also have two of these blank templates here, stem blank 1, stem blank 2. These are inactive. That's why they're italicized and grayed out like this. You can change that with right-clicking and then make active. I have it bound to key commands in my Pro Tools session, but that's custom. It doesn't do that by default. And then in my IO window over here under bus, you can see all of my prints are red. So this is all set up for me. So if we get into our track routing over here, I'll start with drums. I'm going to jump back to the mix window real quick. So on our drum bus here, there's a molt happening. So red is the stem bus, so stem drums, and then instrumental mix bus is just our standard mix path. So that way, basically, like I'm printing a stereo audio track of everything that's going on in my drum section. All my drums will automatically print down to a stereo track. And that's the same for all of my track groups like this. So you can see all of the mults happening here, percussion, bass, guitars, etc. Vocals are the only thing that are a little bit different because I'm multing the lead vocals and the background vocals separately. That's why these are red down here. I love printing mixes for lots of reasons. One, it allows you to do this kind of thing, right? Get all of your stems in one fell swoop. That way you don't have to go back through and bounce your stems repeatedly or worry about other tracks, not being muted when you're doing your bounces. It's just all predetermined by the routing. And then the other thing is that all your processing is baked into those audio tracks when you're done. So, we live in a digital world and people's tools change all the time. We release new versions of plugins. We stop being compatible with old versions of plugins, etc. So that way, if I were to do a mix on this template, print all of my tracks, print my stems, print my mix prints, and then in 5 years, open this session again, all of my processing is going to be baked into those audio files. So I don't have to worry about, I can't recreate this mix because all the plugins I was using at the time are either no longer on my computer or they're old versions that I don't have installed anymore. It's just all printed into the stems, into the mixes. So it's sort of future proof in that way, which is really positive, I think. All right, let's get into some tracks here. So as you can see on all of the tracks, pretty much, except for a couple gaps over here, which I should fix, I'll have an instance of ProQ4 loaded and inactive. ProQ4 is just like my main go-to EQ. I use it for, I would say, probably 95% of my EQing. On a track basis, sometimes I will use other things like that Mog EQ if I want to do something kind of specific, or if I have a specific curve in mind, or if I want to do something sort of Pultec-esque. If I want to make sort of a broader cut or boost, maybe I'll use some kind of hardware emulation, but for the most part, I'm rocking with Q4 on everything. Q4 is loaded. As you can see, it's inactive, so it's grayed out. If I click on it, it'll show up as plugin inactive. This is different than bypass. This is an important concept to know. So if I command click, it'll turn blue. That's bypass, which means that the plugin is available to me, but it's just not, like it's not in the signal path anymore when it's in bypass. It's as though the audio is just passing right through it and it's not being affected by whatever I'm doing. And when you take it out of bypass, it is being affected by what I'm doing. It's different than inactive. When it's in bypass, it's still using CPU resources, it's still using delay compensation, all that stuff. So when it's inactive like this, it is no longer using delay compensation, it's no longer using CPU intensive resources, etc. So that's why I have Q4 inactive across my whole mix. Because if I loaded it up and every instance of Q4, even though it's going to wind up being that way most likely, was active, it's just more CPU intensive than I need. I like to go through and just make them active as I'm using them. The key command for that is Control, Command, and then left click. We'll make active like that. Same deal, make inactive. So I'll have Q4 laid across pretty much the whole mix. I've got some other pieces here and there, like my triggers. So I like to print triggers for kick and for snare in my sessions. For kick in, for example, I will have on my kick in track this prefader send to the kick trigger bus, which is just the bus that this aux track takes an input from, kick trigger. And then I'll have this is the free version of Steven Slate Drums Slate Trigger 2, which is, if you're unfamiliar, basically a drum sample replacement or sample blending tool. It allows you to trigger a drum sample based on your actual audio files, so to listen to your audio and then trigger some new samples. And then the output of this track is to kick print, which is this audio track over here. I like to do this for a couple reasons. One, because once I'm done selecting my samples and triggering my samples, I don't want to be using CPU resources to continually do that while I'm mixing. And two, this trigger software is reactive, right? It's program dependent. So depending on, the stop and start of my playback, or how I'm affecting things, it might trigger a little differently each time I'm working. I don't really like that. I prefer to just like trigger it once, have that trigger be like my trigger performance, so to speak, and then have that rendered in audio so that I can just work with the raw audio. And if I got to do some editing real quick, I can just do that on the audio file. It's more precise. Obviously, the downside is that if I want to tweak my trigger as I'm working, I would have to reprint, but I don't generally find that to be an issue. If you spend enough time working on your triggering in the beginning, then while you're working later on the mix, it's more helpful to just have it as audio. So that's the output of this track, kick print. Kick print is the input of this audio track. So I'll work and then I'll just record enable this track, print my triggering onto this track, and then I'll hide and make this inactive, which I have a key command. Hide and make inactive is really helpful. I have it bound to Command Option Shift Backspace. We'll just get rid of it. So it's no longer here. It's no longer taking up resources. It's inactive. If I want it back, it's over here in my track lists in this dialog box on the left. I can just left click and then show and make active. It'll come back. So same concept over here for snare. On my snare bus, I have snare top, snare bottom, snare trigger, snare print, and then reverse snare. Sometimes people like to do those little reverse effects for snare, so I'll just render that with Deverb as an audio suite plugin real quick. This is where that lives. I got to do it. And then we have toms down here. Same deal. Just 3 tom channels that are all floating to this tom bus, which goes to the drum bus. Overheads, similar concept. Oh, this is actually wrong. Let me fix this with the magic of editing. Okay, as you can see, I've corrected the routing here on overheads just to the drum bus. It's not going to the mix bus anymore. We have the room bus for our drums, so rooms and then rooms mono. Obviously, I may need more of these. Anytime I need more tracks, like I was talking about earlier, I'll duplicate instead of making a new track. So if, let's say I had 2 pairs of stereo rooms and 1 mono room, so I needed a second stereo room track, I would just have this highlighted, and then I would Option Shift D to create a new track. Insert after selected last track. I would deactivate active playlist and alternative playlists and automation probably. This shouldn't be automated, but all I really needed to have is the same inserts, the same sends, the same markers, and the same group assignments. So it'd come in as rooms.dupe1, which is Pro Tools basic name scheme. And so I just double click to rename, and then rooms 2 or something like that. What I'm sure it would make more sense contextually, but as you can see here, It's already routed to the room bus. It already has that inactive instance of ProQ on it. It's orange, which is the color of all my drum tracks. It's in the room bus already. So it just saves a lot of time when you're working on a big template like this where everything's already pre-made for you to just duplicate tracks that exist already instead of making a whole new track and then having to manually go through, make it orange, route it to the room bus, put an inactive instance of Q4 on it, put it in this folder. It's just less work. And then we have my drum room. This is pretty basic. I might have more instances of drum effects loaded up here. This is just an instance of vintage verb and then some inactive EQ after. And so drum room is the input. All of these tracks will have this drum room send on them. Most of them have them on the track bus. So bussing them out has some reverb. And then it's going to the effects input, which is actually over here. So all of my effects fold down to one aux track. I have like an effects master effectively, which is what this folder is. However, I don't have this track in that folder because it's for drum specifically. So it lives in the drum folder. And then this Lindell SBC plugin on my bus is my parallel compression for drums. So I used to do parallel compression for drums on an aux channel. No longer. I just use it straight on the mix bus with this mix knob here. I'll go through and, dial this as I'm working. I'll usually start my drum processing by dialing up the drum bus here. And so this is a plugin alliance version of an API 2500 plus, basically. And that's what I like to use for parallel drum processing. It could change depending on the project, but typically I like the Lindell SBC. And then we have some other tracks here. We've got perk, short for percussion. So shakers, tambourines, bongos, cowbells. Obviously this can change a lot depending on the session, depending on, the source material, what auxiliary percussion tracks I'm going to need. So I'll rename these, I'll change them, I'll duplicate them, I'll change the width, etc. And then these are all running to just my basic effects, which I have lined up over here, room plate, quarter eight, chorus, etc. for me to play around with. So they're all set up and then they're all bypassed. So I can just go in and turn these on because I like my sends all at -5 by default. You can change that setting in your Pro Tools preferences instead of being at -infinity all the way down. So that way, if I want something to have a little bit of quarter, I can just come over here and unbypass this send here, and it's getting quarter delay, and then I can come through and adjust the level accordingly. So that's it for percussion, pretty simple. Bass, I just have an amp and a DI track over here. I don't have my effect sends on these guys because I typically don't wind up running bass to very wet stuff. Obviously, I can duplicate these if I need more, but pretty simple there. I just have bass. Guitars, I have 5 guitar tracks preset. Usually wind up needing more than that, so I'll duplicate as many as I want. Same deal with these guys. They're all running to those effects. If I want to, wet up some guitars a little bit, throw a little bit of plate here and there, I can do that. Pianos, same deal. I just have 2 stereo piano tracks. I like to put pianos in a separate label than synths. I like to have a split for acoustic piano and for synths because the way I treat them in a mix would probably change a lot, and the way that they're recorded changes a lot. Obviously, stereo DI versus like real mics. So I like to have them separated out. And then we have my synth here. So I have this synth misc track, synth miscellaneous, just a stereo audio track. Sometimes I get synth heavy tracks that have lots of different synths, and I don't really know how to categorize them. And it doesn't really fit into leads or pads. So I just kind of have like this floating audio track within the overall synth bus here that I can throw sort of assignments to that I don't really feel like work well under synth leads or synth pads. And then synth leads and synth pads, I just have stereo audio tracks within them. I'm expecting stereo, 90% of the time for synths. Obviously, I can come through and just make these mono if I need to. Horns, pretty basic. Alto, tenor, trumpet, and trombone. Most of the horns I'm going to be working on in a given session. There's whole horn sections. I actually would probably import that group of tracks from my jazz template. On projects that I'm working on, most of the horns are going to be MIDI horns. They're going to be sample horns. So they'll just be stereo tracks anyway. But I have these set up. I'll duplicate them as needed. I don't use this a ton, but I have it here. And then vocals. So I have my lead vocal here, lead vox 1 and 2, 3 harmony tracks. And then I have some vocal throws. So if you're unfamiliar, throw tracks are basically just wet affected tracks for you to copy bits of audio to. So if you want to do like, a snippet of the track, a couple words or something like that with this like phone effect, I have that preloaded up. This is just like the stock Pro Q phone EQ. I have other things programmed in here. There's some presets on Soundtoys Effects Rack, H delay going for some quarter note throws, some half note throws, various things, which is part of why I like to put mixes on the grid. When I'm doing mixes, I'll ask for the BPM and put it on the grid so that my effect throws make sense. I've got my throws and then my background vocals, some more audio tracks for background vocals. For vocal effects, it's pretty straightforward. Just going in order with my parallel compression here. I just have an instance of CLA 76, the Blue Stripe revision, specifically the Rev A. So all buttons in mode, 1176 on all buttons in mode is my go-to for parallel compression on vocals, and just kind of in general for parallel compression. That's really when you get that kind of smashed, saturated 1176 character on things. The Rev A specifically has more distortion than the Rev D, the black version of the 1176. So this is usually where I start. It usually winds up being a little different than this, but this effectively is like my starting point for parallel compression on vocal. And then I may add parallel saturation as well, depending on the context, the genre. And then for room, just running vintage verb here. I'm running little plate for my plate reverb. I'm running vintage verb again for my hall, and then echo boy for my quarter note delay. And then we are on to my main effects. So these are just kind of my track effects. I can bust whatever I want in the course of the session through to these guys. So just room, plate, hall, quarter, eighth, and then a chorus. I love this chorus. Is a little bit of like a secret weapon of mine that I picked up from Dave Darlington. Just sending stuff to some chorus. I'm actually just using this tall free chorus as a free plugin. It's an emulation of like the Roland Juno chorus circuit. I think it sounds great. Just kind of super wet like this, all the way, both chorus modes on, all the way wet, stereo width cranked all the way up, and then just use it as a parallel track. So you can see I have all of these at -10. And then obviously, like, I'll keep this pretty low. I'll keep the chorus pretty low. I love it on synths, and even sometimes keys, just like it adds a little bit of extra sauce. So there's a little secret for you. My parallel chorus track, I love that. Then everything folds down to this effects folder. Like I said, I have some other effects like the vocal effects and drum effects running to this channel, even though they're not in this folder. That's just if I want to, if it's a really dense mix and the effects are kind of getting in the way, I can turn this on. This is just like a big cut through the midband on a Q4 in mid-side mode. That's another little trick. Really helpful for kind of pushing things further back in the mix. And that's it. So let me know in the comments if you guys enjoyed this, if you want to see more stuff on templates, if you want to see a video about how I would load this template. That'll be coming next week. Thanks a lot.